Hi, everyone. This is Helen Rosenfeld. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Science and Engineering Fair. I'm really excited that we are able to launch our speaker series today with speaker Nathan Blazon Brown, who I only recently learned is a former MSEF participant. So I can't think of a better way for us to jumpstart the series with someone who's been through the process of science fair. I'm sure he'll touch on that a little bit. But without further ado, because he's going to walk you through his background and his academic and career choices, I'm going to turn it right over to him to share his background with you. And I will monitor just a few housekeeping tips. I'll monitor the chat for any questions that come up, and it probably will be easier for me to manage Q&A that way, although I'm sure as we go through, we'll figure out a way to allow people to ask questions directly. So I'd like to introduce Nathan, and I'm going to just pull up some slides that he will share with you. One moment. So here we go.
And thank you, Helen. Apologies if you hear sirens and helicopters. There's a fire a few blocks down the road from me right now, so things are a little loud in my neighborhood. So apologies for that, guys. Like Helen said, my name is Nathan, and I'm going to be presenting to you a bit on, I'm 25 years old. I've had a brief career so far in biotech and in biological research. But just going to touch upon some of the things that I've been able to do at this point, how I got there, because I think one of the most difficult things when going to school and going through high school and eventually going to college is figuring out, okay, how do I get to my vocation I want to do? And how do I know what that looks like if I don't know anybody who has ever done that? And so here is a meandering career through biology and healthcare. Next slide, please. So, so brief introduction. My name is Nathan Blazon Brown. I'm from Methuen, Massachusetts. Shout out to anybody who's from the Merrimack Valley who's watching this right now. I earned a BS biology degree with a focus in biotechnology from UMass Lowell. And I currently work as a research associate on a gene therapy product, specifically working on the quality of that product for a biotech company here in the Valley. Next slide. And so I guess just going over what I'll be talking about today, how I got to this position now, and what are some of the things that it took for me to get to this point in my career. And I'm also going to touch upon, speaking is a bit about more focused on biological and chemical research. And so I'll talk a bit about the difference between academic and industry work. Because everybody knows when they're in high school what it's like to be a doctor, and then you hear that you can be a scientist, but being a scientist is a very abstract thing, and it means many different things depending on where you choose to go with your career. And then I'll also touch upon and happily answer any questions anybody has for their advice for going through college and setting yourself up for a career in this field. Next slide, please. And so just a brief little timeline. I graduated high school in 2013 and went to Stony Brook University down in New York. There I joined a lab my freshman year. I had to email about 20 different professors to get into a lab. So one of the first things I'll recommend is be annoying and bother every single person you can. I mean, be polite about it, but put yourself out there. Luck is 50% opportunity and 50% preparedness. And in order to be prepared, you have to put yourself out there. Eventually, I ended up transferring to UMass Lowell. And part of that transfer was realizing I didn't know exactly where I wanted to go with my career. I had done some research in a laboratory, but I was considering healthcare. I was considering going to try to be a doctor, to be a PA, and I knew I wanted to try different opportunities that I might have a bit more of at home. And so I went to UMass Lowell. While I was at UMass Lowell, I worked in another undergraduate laboratory. I worked as an EMT for a couple years because I wanted to get an idea of what healthcare was like. Eventually I graduated in 2017, and I went on to work a couple of jobs, one at a company that tested medical devices. I ended up doing an academic post as well at Boston Children's, and I'll speak a little bit about both of those. But kind of the main theme I want to stress to people is that you will study something. You'll study biology, psychology, chemistry, maybe not even a STEM. Maybe you're just here out of sheer curiosity or boredom with COVID-19 going on. But the only way to truly know what it's like to work in a field is to start to try to work in it or get as close as you can. So that's going to be the overall theme. Next slide, please. So just in general, one of the academic positions are the positions that you're going to be taught about the most as you go through college, mostly because your professors are in academic positions. So when they describe what it's like doing the job of an academic researcher, they're really only going to have a perspective on academia. And so what is that? What is the goal when you're in an academic position? Generally, it's to discover new things. In my field, is to discover new things about biology, how different cells work, how different animals work, how even down to the nitty gritty, how different proteins work within a cell. Get very specific very quickly. And there's some really great pros to this type of work. Your job is to learn and discover. You get to make these amazing discoveries of things that other people hadn't. And that is a truly remarkable feeling when you get to say, wow, I now know something that no one else knew before me. And it's because of work I did. It's very empowering. And there's a lot of collaboration, which leads you to learn even more. The cons are that you really have to be patient. You could spend a year working to write you could spend an entire year's worth of work to write a 4-page journal article. And that'll be the extent of what you'll have accomplished in that year. And throughout that year, it can feel like you haven't done anything, but eventually you get to this point where you've produced something, you've contributed. But it is a very different work environment in comparison to, say, industry, which if we go to the next slide, I'll speak on. So in industry positions, it gets a little different. You don't quite have the freedom you had in an academic position to explore new unexplored sciences. You're really more focused on whatever the project of the company you're working for is. So your goals will be to develop new products for treatments, research, to develop new materials or machines to support other folks who are doing research. Occasionally there'll be a little bit of actual like exploring, but it's very focused in whatever your company is hired you to do. The pros of this is that there's a lot more money behind these industry companies, and you get to see your results a lot quicker. So you might spend in an academic position 20 years researching something only to find out that then it has a, say, therapeutic benefit in a patient. In industry, you'll see those results a lot sooner. The cons are that the work can be very demanding. You don't quite get as many opportunities to learn. You have to really search for those on your own. And there can be lots of rules because you have to answer to the federal government in the way you do things. So an example would be in a bit of the work I do now. I work for a company that develops gene therapies for muscular dystrophies. And in the time that I've been with this company, I've got to see patients dosed, and I've got to see patient data come back. Pictured here is one of the, and this is public information available on the internet. Pictured here is a physician who collaborates with our company with a patient that we've dosed of a gene therapy. I mean, it's pretty incredible. We get to see patients benefiting from the work we do, and it's very satisfying. Next slide, please. And so I guess the question comes down to which is better. And that's kind of the crux of what I want to get at, is that you have no idea which one you like. I had no idea which one I would like. Really the only way to figure out if you love something is to do it and find out, oh, I like that, or oh, this is horribly boring, I don't like this at all. And so I think one of the best ways to do that is to just do it. It's hard. It can be very hard, particularly in times like these to find opportunities and find positions. But as you go through your education, it's very important to focus on your academics. I'm sure a lot of you here observing this talk are planning on going off to college. And that is wonderful. But part of that should also be you, not just learning and earning your degree, but learning how that degree applies to a vocation you want. And that can be even harder if you don't know what vocation you want, like most of us do. We think we know, but then we start to understand what that job entails. I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And I started spending times with patients as an EMT, and I went, oh man, I do not like this. Patients are very difficult. Some of them can be very mean. I don't know if I want to deal with this. So there's a list of a bunch of different jobs I worked in. Some of them I loved, some of them I hated, but they all helped inform me and help me drive towards where I am now, to be confident that I'm where I'm supposed to be. Next slide, please. And so I guess just a little bit of brief advice, and then we can go in and have a bit of a discussion about things. Like I said earlier, try everything you could possibly like. Just as important as your grades is going to be the experience you get. One of the most important things you realize is that if you volunteer your time for someone, you can learn while you do that. Oftentimes in a lot of these undergraduate positions where you might be working in a lab or volunteering at a hospital, you are volunteering your labor and your time in order to receive training on things. And that can be difficult, and it can sometimes be difficult to convince people that this is a worthwhile opportunity, especially in the moment when you're not earning any money for it and you could be doing other things. But I guarantee you that it will help you see you progress in your career. You should also work on finding a mentor, someone who works in your field. And that can also be very difficult. It'll be easier for those students who try to end up going on to college, but for those students who are in high school now and will be in high school for another couple of years, MSEF is another great resource for trying to connect you with people. Reaching out to local universities, even if it's not to get a position, but just to get a tour, see what it's like. These can be very important because I remember being in high school and college and spending a lot of time listening to the advice of people my age and thinking that was the appropriate thing to do, only to realize years later that I was listening to people who knew just as little as I did about my future career. And the other thing I'll say is I think the best thing anybody could do if you haven't worked a job, go try to get a job for the summer. COVID's going to make that very difficult. So some empty advice, unfortunately, but getting a summer job, even if it's not having anything to do with what you want to do. I worked in a bank in high school. I umpired baseball. I waited tables, and all of those things helped teach me how to be a good employee and teach me how to learn and teach me how to multitask. And they made transitioning into roles that were very important for developing my career a lot easier, because you learn things working that you otherwise won't in school. And so that's kind of just a brief presentation on where I am, who I am. So is there any questions individuals might have out there for figuring out things in their future career or in high school now with science fair?
Thank you, Nathan. I'm going to start off the questions with, you had mentioned early on about the fact that you were relentless about reaching out to folks who might help you with your lab interest. And I think a lot of students often are kind of daunted by how do you find people who can give you that first leg up, and the coaching and the sort of mentorship. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit about that process of how you did that, and both maybe an anecdote of something that worked really well and an anecdote of perhaps something that backfired that you learned from in retrospect.
For sure. So I guess what worked was sending many emails. So the lab I ended up getting into, I emailed probably 20 or so labs, and it was one of the first things I did when I got on campus. But there were 2 or 3 that I was really interested in. And so when I didn't hear back from anybody in a couple weeks, professors are very busy, beginning of the semester, they can be difficult to get a hold of. I just started walking around the chemistry building, just trying to walk by offices and see when a professor might be in their office. I've always found that face-to-face conversation is so much more a convincing way to try to get what you want. It's kind of the best way to put it.
Yeah.
And that was how I ended up getting it. Turns out the professor I was really interested in, I'd emailed her 3 times. The reason she didn't get back to me was because she was on maternity leave. A very valid reason for not getting back to a 18-year-old student. But when I came in and saw her, and I had prepared, that was the other thing, I read up on what the lab had been doing to show that I was interested. And we sat down and we had about a 20-30 minute conversation just about what her lab does, what I was looking for, what my experience was. And my experience in the field was nothing, absolutely nothing. I'd taken courses in high school, but I'd never held a pipette in my hands. I'd never conducted experiments. And she expected that. She doesn't expect a freshman in college to know the world. And from there, that worked. So face-to-face and persistence was definitely something that worked. Something that didn't work was what I was doing prior to that, which was just sending out emails and sitting at home frustrated that no one was getting back to me. I think one of the other things I'd like to highlight is that there were 2 things, though, that helped me make an impression. And they came from work experience that had nothing to do with biotech or biology research. One was I knew how to write emails in a very professional manner. I worked in a bank for a couple of years, and I frequently had to email individuals who were pretty important. And I learned from watching how other people wrote their emails, how to properly format it, how to sound professional when I wrote. So that has always helped me early on in my career in conveying to someone that I am a professional, well put together individual. The other was that when I worked at the bank or when I waited tables, you have to learn customer service. And that's just what we're doing right here, having a conversation, speaking publicly. And I was a lot more confident and capable of doing that because I had worked jobs where I had to do that. So when I went in to meet the professor for the first time, I was able to confidently carry a conversation and ask questions and even just have the courage to walk into her office and announce who I was and ask her if she had any time, which was not something I'd say I'd be able to do midway through high school.
Great, thank you. I want to open it up to anyone else who has questions. I have a host more of my own, but I want to give the students who are on the call a chance. You're probably muted and your video is turned off, but if you want to unmute and ask a question, or put it in the chat, we can manage that for you.
Please, there are no bad questions.
So while we wait for a few questions, I'll add another one, which is many of our students today on the call are either in high school or middle school. What are perhaps some of the different types of advice around mentorship and project-based learning that you might suggest for them at this point? You did share about getting a job and how any sort of job is a helpful leg up, but perhaps there's something that you can reflect on from your high school experience about either work or advice from teachers that have, that coached you through that experience.
For sure. Most of high school and the way that we're taught and the way that we learn is a lot of memorization. The sciences included, or learning math proofs for physics or math or chemistry. It's learn a formula, apply it. It's memorize the organelles of a cell, get examined on it. And there aren't a lot of instances where we get our critical thinking tested. And it's not always something, critical thinking, that's, I think, rewarded in how we're typically graded in high school, or at least how I was. I can only speak from my own experience. But as you get further into college, and as you certainly get out into your career, the skills that helped you do really well in school aren't always the ones that help you continue in your career. And one of the few instances where I got to really train myself on critical thinking was science fair. I earned nothing extra towards my grades. I think it certainly helped on my college application, but in the short term, there wasn't any reward for working really hard on a science fair project. In Methuen High School, my partner and I, we did a science fair experiment, the effect of light on the firing of the shotgun fungus. Really neat. Pilobolus crystallinus, look it up. My parents were really mad at me because I grew fungus in our basement for a few weeks, but it failed like 2 or 3 times. And we were so angry and so frustrated, but we didn't give up and we kept doing it almost to spite the project. But because we did so, we were able to learn a lot about troubleshooting, problem solving. And when we went to the fair, those were things, we had some good judges that they asked us about. How did it go? Did it work well the first time? And we were able to convey to them that we went through a lot of critical thinking in order to do it. And we ended up placing honorable mention at the science fair. And that was a really rewarding experience and something that both my partner and I were able to put on our college applications that I have a feeling was very helpful in me getting accepted to schools and earning scholarships. So yeah, it won't feel like a reward in the short term. It'll feel like a lot of unnecessary work if you're just focused on my grades, which is what I know was my main focus when I was a high school student, and I'm sure a lot of the other students here are high achieving students who really want to do well in school. But it's worth it in the long run. And that's the game you have to be playing.
Yeah, great. We have a question here from Dominique Dang.
Yeah.
In your opinion, which field do you enjoy more, academic or industry? Is the education needed for industry as rigorous as the education for an academic field?
This is a very good question. As to what I enjoy more, it sounds like a cop-out, but I do enjoy both. I find myself missing, I worked, while I was graduating college, I started at a company. Then I went to an academic position at Boston Children's, and now I'm at a company, a private company again. And each time I've moved on, I've missed aspects of the other job. And I can only say that in industry, I was very satisfied. I'm the type of person who likes to work hard, and I feel very satisfied when I've completed something. And industry offers a lot of that, a lot of check marks, a lot of projects that are shorter term. So I feel like I've completed things. And that is very lacking in academia, where you can go 4 months without having completed something that looks tangible, that I have created this data, here you go, this is this data. You'll spend a month researching papers to try to figure out what you're even going to do. So the student in me loves that, because the academic position, I was getting paid to learn. And for a long time, I was like, wow, this is amazing. So that's it. It comes down to, if you're a lifelong student, academia will probably be something you love. If you're someone who also wants to see some of the immediacy of what you've done, industry offers some benefits in that regard. As far as the education necessary for industry as rigorous as the education for an academic field, and I'm assuming this is someone who's a bit more later on in their high school career, or even an MSEF member who's asking this question, but the education, so in order to proceed, in academia, there's a hierarchy. There are primary investigators, which are typically professors, tenured professors at a university or in a institution like a hospital. And those individuals are the ones who receive funding from NIH, from the federal government, from private groups to conduct research. And they are the ones who get to drive everything. In order to really reach that stage and become that individual, it is standard to have a PhD, or depending on the field, an MD. There are very few PIs in the biological sciences that have just their master's or their bachelor's. I can't speak for engineering, Oftentimes, when it comes to engineering, a bachelor's or master's degree will get you a little further, at least in industry. I can't speak much to academia for that. As far as biology, though, it definitely is, and that's something I've evaluated over the last couple of years. I'm determining if I want to go back to school to earn a PhD. I'm working on my master's right now as I work, partially because I just want to keep learning. Also because I have an employer who wants me to continue to learn, which is a nice thing to have. Yeah, definitely you can get a little further in industry. The short of it is you can get a little further in industry with less of an education. But you can still know as much. That's one of the interesting things. You will meet master's holders who are some of the smartest people you've ever met in your life, and PhDs that occasionally make you question how they earned one. Most people you meet, though, in this field are incredibly brilliant, particularly in the Boston and Cambridge area. You throw a rock and you'll hit a genius scientist.
And can I add to that question, perhaps, for
Please.
how easy is it to switch between, sort of from a pathway perspective? Once you've decided what you want to do, are you sort of held to that track? And is there one of the directions that's easier to go to the other one from than vice versa?
Okay, I can speak on some anecdotal things. I have no idea of statistics for this field, so disclaimer on that. I do know that with academia, there can be a bit of a bias towards, so getting into a PhD program, which if your goal is to make academia your career, is the route you really need to take, at least in biology, chemistry, and translational medicine. There is, I've noticed, a bit of a bias towards PhD candidates who are younger. PIs tend to want to work their PhD students or any of their students very, very hard. And I think a lot of the bias comes towards younger people because they have a bit more time and can be a bit more focused, as opposed to when they get into later years and they start a career. As for the transition, industry to academia, I think, can be a little difficult. Then again, it's newer. We're at a stage where I don't think that, and I don't have the perspective really, but biotech is larger than I think it's ever been. And so I don't know that there's a lot of people leaving biotech to go to academia. I can speak to academics coming to industry. It happens all the time, particularly when you work on cutting edge projects. So I work on a gene therapy platform. That's a pretty small field. And the amount of people who have a lot of experience in regulatory and dealing with the FDA and bringing a drug to market, and the amount of people who also have the biology understanding of a gene therapy, that's a very small list of people. So oftentimes, like, my team is composed of people who have one or the other. So I have a bit of that industry experience from previous jobs, and that's where most of my contribution comes from. I make it a goal to understand the biology of what we're doing, but most of the virologists on my team and biologists, they came straight out of postdocs. Following their PhD, they did academic positions at Brigham and Women's, at Boston Children's, at Harvard Medical School. And so the transition can happen. You may not start off, all your years in academia may not translate, but I think you're able to move fairly well.
Great. We have a question here. How long did it take to locate the career path you wanted to pursue, and what would you recommend to a high school student who has yet to find a career path that caters to their passions?
So the answer to that is work. And it took me a while. I started out in high school thinking I wanted to do medicine, and kept wanting to do medicine. And I got my lab position when I joined college solely because I had heard that in order to get into medical school, you should have some academic research under your belt, something they want on your med school application. And so I did the research, but I fell in love with it. And so now I had a bit of a quandary. What am I doing? Why am I in school? And so that led me to also explore, well, I know I like this research stuff, but how do I know that I don't want to be a doctor? How can I get an understanding of what healthcare is like? And so I sought out a job as an EMT, and I saw some amazing things, and I loved the job, but through that job, I was able to observe physicians from time to time and get an idea of what their day-to-day was like. And I figured out that I liked being on the science and the back end of things, the designing of medicines maybe, as opposed to the application of medicines and the diagnosing of patients. But as far as how long it took, I'm still figuring out the career path I want to do. I'm still figuring out if I want to do a PhD. I think I'm leaning towards staying in industry, but one of the things I've constantly done throughout my academic career is about every 6 months, I reevaluate my plan. What do I want to do? And am I on track to do it? And I also try to set myself up so that I have multiple options. So like when I did my undergraduate degree, around my beginning of my senior year, I was still unsure I was pretty sure I wanted to do research, but I wasn't convinced I didn't want to possibly go to PA school. And so I made sure to take the course requirements that were necessary to get me into PA school so that I could continue to work as an EMT and figure out if that's what I wanted to do. Eventually I figured out that I didn't want to do that, and I didn't take the courses for nothing. I learned a lot about anatomy and physiology because of it. But I think setting yourself up for multiple plans and exposing yourself to as many things as possible is important. If I actually wrote down every job I had on my resume, I would have approximately a dozen jobs over the last 5 years. I was baking cupcakes on Newbury Street at one point as a part-time job while working at Boston Children's. It's all helpful.
So the next question picks up on some of that. When you first started a job like bank assistant, how did you put yourself out there and figure out where you'd want to apply, where you wanted to apply, and how would you describe your experience in getting the job?
Yeah, so I started out, applied to Market Basket, like I'm sure many of you work at or know people who work at Market Basket, because half of my high school worked at Market Basket. And Market Basket turned me down, which was a real downer. I applied to Kmart. Kmart wasn't hiring. And this bank just had an open position that a family friend told me about. I applied, and I was the assistant to the IT director. So the entire IT department for this small bank was a guy named Keith and myself. And so I spent the summer cleaning out old data files so that they could do a system conversion for customer information. Odd job. It helped me to this day. I'm very good with Microsoft Excel, which is an important part of my job now because of it. But as far as putting myself out there, I just applied to anything. I applied to an ice cream shop down the road from me. I was gonna just start cutting lawns on my streets because I wasn't sure I was going to get anything. My parents had some good advice in that. Well, my parents, it wasn't so much advice. They told me, you're getting a job. You're 16, you're getting a job. That's just happening. But they gave me advice, and I was like, oh, I don't know what I want to work as. And they're like, well, your options are limited. You're a 16-year-old as to what you can do. You're not going to be a doctor right now, but just go do something. Work experience is good for you. And I think they were right. So I'm a little biased in my opinions towards work. I think I've grown up in a family that values it.
Well, I'm just going to echo what I've heard you say a few times in different ways, which is the communication skills that you've acquired through all of these different jobs have been key in finding yourself where you are now. It's helped you communicate with teachers, with professors, with the ecosystem that you are either studying or working in. And I sort of think back to the whole process of preparing for science fair, which is also the research, but equally it's how you communicate that to an outside audience and to the judges, and how important that is, no matter what you choose to do. So any other questions? Because I can keep on going with my questions, but I want to make sure that the students who are on have a chance to ask. So while I'm waiting for some other questions, maybe you can tell us or give us a snapshot of what a day in your life is like with the research work you're doing.
Sure,
Or,
sure.
yeah.
So yeah, my role right now is not so much, the term research associate often is the title for many things, but I don't do much new research. The work I do is we have a gene therapy that we want to dose patients with, and it's a therapy that's going through clinical trials right now, and we're starting to manufacture it in large scale. In order to give it to patients, we need enough of the drug, and a lot of my work is making sure that the new manufacturing processes that they're doing are creating a clean drug. And so I test its ability to, the gene therapy we use is a virus that we've redesigned and turned into a gene therapy. We've basically turned the virus into something friendly as opposed to something harmful. And it's my job to make sure that it is doing what it's supposed to, that it infects the appropriate way. And so most of my day is spent in a lab performing experiments to test the material. I work with DNA, I work with cell lines, and I work with viruses. And then another part of my day is just general chores and maintenance of the lab. The lab needs to be clean. We need to make sure we have the appropriate materials in order to do our job. So just like cooking, you can't run out of flour if your job is to bake cakes. Otherwise, all of a sudden, you're a bakery that doesn't have anything to sell. So if we run out of our materials, our work stops, and that's a big problem. Other things like learning how to properly conduct our experiments so that the FDA is happy with us. In another life, I think I'd be a lawyer because I have to understand a lot of the codes in which we operate under. It's very legal. So sometimes I'm reading a lot, but mostly I'm in the lab performing experiments.
Great. So I think if we don't have more questions, maybe you can wrap us up with some advice to your middle or high school self. You know, reflecting back, what would you have told yourself, or what have you learned since that you would reflect on?
That is a very good question. Probably relax a little bit more. I think I gave myself much anxiety about becoming a successful person, making money and having a career and doing something I was proud of. And I expected to have that done immediately. And I was frequently disappointed throughout high school and college when all of a sudden I didn't have those things and still don't have those things. It takes a long time to get to a point. A doctor isn't a full-fledged doctor until after, 4 years of medical school, another 4 to 6 years of residency. It takes 10 years. It takes a long time to build yourself into a position where you're at your end goal. A lot of it is learning the basics and earning your way in. And so I guess I would just tell my past self to relax a little bit, keep working hard, but don't be so hard on yourself when you haven't achieved all the things you want to, because you're 16, 17, 18 years old. Yeah, it's the hardest thing, because as you get older, you do start to realize that things take time. But it's only once you're older. So I'm preaching to the choir, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you so much for helping us kick off our speaker series.
Sure.
Excellent advice for our scientists and engineers in the making. And I just want to tell everyone on the call that we're doing these speaker series talks every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday for the next couple of weeks. We're posting the list of all the speakers on our website, so you can look up who's going to be up on Tuesday. And we also recorded this, so if you have friends that didn't get a chance to call in today, we'll have that also up on our website in the next day or two. So thank you everyone for participating, and look forward to seeing you on future calls. And thanks again, Nathan, for your time today. Really appreciate it.
For sure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.